Recently, I went on a 3-day PC building adventure from knowing nothing about PCs, like literally not knowing what GPU stood for, to a sufficient understanding of PCs to build this computer from scratch. So come learn with me in this PC building guide for novices. In this guide, we'll be going over 3 main topics. First, the research, in which we'll understand the basic functions of PC components, as well as what is a good standard for today. In the second chapter, we'll go over purchasing, selecting where and what to purchase and what to spend most on. In the final chapter, we'll focus on how you actually slap together these components to build a functional PC. The first chapter will go over 7 different components: the case, the motherboard, processor, graphics card, the memory, hard drives, and the power supply unit. Let's begin! The case/chassis is the external casing for PC components. It dictates the size of the motherboard you'll be using, which is the computer heart, and available cooling options. The case is most customizable to personal preferences, and in my opinion is most important to the visual aesthetics of your computer. We have 3 main types of case/chassis. There are full towers, mid towers, and mini towers. Some cases come with pre-installed cooling. For example, mine came with 3 120mm fans on its front. You'll have an easier time building cases that come with pre-installed cooling, and they typically come cheaper as well. With a naked case, there will be no pre-installed fans, but it is more customizable, giving you more agency to control how cooling is operated. So I've said coolants a lot, but what are coolants? Really, they just prevent overheating of PC components. There's 2 main types. There are fans and liquid coolants. Fans are most common and affordable, but they're typically loud. They're attached to the case and/or CPU and are commonly 120 to 140mm. On the other hand, liquid coolants are more expensive but have better cooling properties. They come with pre-filled pumps and a radiator with fans. Typically, these are attached to CPUs. In my case, I have a mixture of liquid coolants and fans. The acronym AIO stands for all-in-one. The final option, which is an extension of liquid coolants, is custom cooling, which is the most expensive option that creates custom liquid pipes throughout your case to provide infinitely better cooling. Onto motherboards. Motherboards are the computer hearts, connecting all the other components together. Sizes include ATX, eATX, mini ATX, and so on. Some motherboards are not pre-equipped with Wi-Fi or Bluetooth modules, which is an important consideration in selecting your motherboard. Another important consideration is compatibility. Your motherboard needs to be compatible with your other components. For example, a motherboard is matched to the brand of processor used, such as Intel or AMD. You cannot use an AMD processor on a motherboard that is fit for an Intel series processor. And this is the same with your other components as well. So motherboards are quite complicated, and so we have a few keywords that dictates your potential for upgrades, as well as the amount of components you can add to it. We have PCIEs. These are slots used to connect powerful components such as graphic cards. The most recent and fastest is PCI 5.0. The number next to the PCIe refers to the PCIe size, and this should match the component. M.2s are other slots used to connect M.2 components, such as solid-state drives, which are basically long-term storage devices. Having 1 or 2 is more than enough. DDR refers to double data rate, and it's related to RAM speed, which is your computer's short-term memory. The motherboard DDR and RAM DDR have to match. For example, my motherboard is DDR5 and my RAM is DDR5. We'll be talking more about RAM later. The I/O panel stands for input-output panel, and it allows USB connections of different types as well as HDMIs. HDMIs enable monitor connections. Processors. Processors act as the frontal lobe of the computer, which basically means they're responsible for decision making. In the most recent processors, more extensive cooling is required. There are 2 main brands for processors, as mentioned before, the Intel series and AMD series. While they are quite similar in price and function, Intel is generally better all around for productivity apps as well as gaming, whereas the recent AMD processors have greater gaming performance. Graphic cards, GPU, handle graphic-related information. They usually have their own HDMI or display ports for monitor connection, and they connect to PCI slots on the motherboard, as mentioned earlier. There are two types of graphic cards. There are discrete and integrated ones. Discrete graphic cards come solely as it is. This allows the user more agency in component selection and later upgrades of it. And there is better performance overall, at least in my experience. In integrated graphic cards, there's less agency in selection and upgrading, but requires less cooling. Encoders are only really important if you decide to create content. Encoders basically convert video to digital files. So if you use editor software like DaVinci Resolve, an encoder on your graphic card will help immensely. NVIDIA GPUs always come with inbuilt encoders. VRAM refers to the visual random access memory, essentially short-term memory that is exclusive to graphic-related information. This VRAM is specific to video games. A similar exclusive graphic-related memory is GDDR-SDRAM, which is for graphic-related information of other PC functions, other than gaming. I've been saying RAM a lot, but what is it? It stands for Random Access Memory and acts as the computer's short-term memory. The capacity for the short-term memory is measured in gigabytes, and obviously the higher the better. Motherboards will typically have a maximum limit on RAM, so if you're looking to further upgrade your RAM, make sure to get a motherboard with a higher upper limit. As mentioned before, DDR refers to double data rate and refers to how fast information is transferred. DDR5 is the most recent and up-to-date. DIMM, double inline memory module, is actually what we kind of refer to when we say RAM. These are RAM sticks, and they contain multiple RAM chips. There are many variations to DIMM based on what you want in a computer, such as a laptop or if you want a desktop computer. The most important thing about these variations is to make sure that when you're upgrading RAM, i.e. adding more RAM sticks, you should make sure these variations are the same to prevent any from malfunctioning. Now onto hard drives. Where RAM is the computer's short-term memory, hard drives act as the computer's long-term memory. There are a few different types of hard drives currently. There's hard disk drives, HDD, which is currently outdated and should generally be avoided. There are SSDs, which stand for solid state drives / semiconductor state drives, and are dynamic and faster storage. Then there are SSDs M.2, and these are the fastest currently on the market and connect to M.2 slots on the motherboard, if you remember earlier when we were talking about motherboards. As you can see, the earlier HDD and SSD are SATA devices. These connect to the motherboard in a different way than M.2, so do be wary of that. Finally, the PSU stands for Power Supply Unit. This supplies power to the computer, and you should select your PSU based on the voltage used from all the other components. This can be calculated using online calculators such as Newegg, which will be linked below. And that's essentially it. Those are 8 main components for a functioning computer. Now we're going to be looking at purchasing, what you should spend the most money on, how you can go about finding components that you want, as well as some pros and cons of retailers. Spending priority. This is a kind of tier list of what you should spend the most on to the least on. Obviously, this will be subjective depending on how high-end your computer is. First, we have the graphics card, then the processor, then motherboard, RAM sticks, the case, coolant, storage in hard drives, then the power supply unit. Obviously, it's subjective as said before. For example, high-end graphic cards will require better cooling systems. Component selection. How do you go about finding components that you want? You can utilize the keywords listed in Chapter 1, for example in the motherboard using words such as PCIe 5.0 or having a certain number of M.2 slots, specifying Intel or AMD to search for your desired component. Alternatively, you can go to streamers on Reddit. It's good in ascertaining what you want from other people's experiences in layman's terms. Streamers are typically known to have higher quality components, so viewing streamer builds allows you to identify what the current standards are. If you want a more in-depth analysis, you can go to tech-oriented websites such as Tom's Hardware, which usually have reviews for most components on the market. Another key term is bottlenecking or limiting. Essentially, components of vastly different qualities or effectiveness will limit the performance of other components that are of higher qualities. Retailers. Should you go online or in store? Personally, I went online because there's a bigger catalog and it's generally cheaper, but I did have some mishaps with shipping/websites. Onto the final chapter, building. In this chapter, we'll discuss tutorials and safety, and BIOS drivers and others. Tutorials and safety. I will not be giving you an in-depth tutorial on how you build your computer because it varies depending on each case, which is why I suggest you go into YouTube and search for build tutorials based on your specific chassis. You can search the name of your chassis, build. These tutorials can typically be followed without incident, but if you do encounter an issue, there are usually very in-depth manuals provided with components, especially the motherboard manual. Safety. Power should never be run through the PC while tampering with the motherboard or anything inside the chassis. Rubber gloves should also be worn when touching the motherboard and CPU. BIOS drivers and others. After the PC is built, you need to connect a monitor, mouse, and keyboard to be able to access the computer's BIOS, basic input-output system. In BIOS, you can view whether your components are properly connected to the motherboard. In addition, you can select your preferred boot option, which is essentially your operating system, such as Windows. A USB with your preferred operating system should be plugged into the computer. Once this has been done correctly, you will find the option to change your boot method to that chosen operating system. In the case of Windows, you will change the boot option to Windows to access Windows operating system, but will later have to purchase a digital license to activate that version of Windows. You can download Windows on their official website. Drivers. Drivers are software components that allow communication between components. They can be downloaded online via the website associated with your motherboard. For example, the drivers for ROG motherboards can be downloaded via their official download center. Another point about BIOS I'd like to mention is safe booting. If you plan on playing video games such as Valorant or League of Legends that use the Vanguard client for anti-cheat, you will need to activate Secure Boot. And that is essentially it, and a beginner's guide for PC building. I want to say a huge thank you for watching the video, and good luck! If you have any more questions or queries, feel free to join the Discord server I made down below. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like, subscribe, and maybe check out my stream at twitch.tv/flicken_. Thank you!